DJing.
Yeah, man. On the ones and twos. I just need a stage name.
Oh, and blowing the horns.
Yes, and blowing the horns, huh?
Blow the horns.
Where are the horns? Where are the horns? Where are the horns?
So, Manda, you did take a picture and you said you tell us how it makes you feel. I really want to know how it really is making you feel. That picture.
But you can see
it
that.
touched me on my studio.
Oh my word.
All right. Where's everyone
Hello,
coming from? It's a bit warm in here. Where's Tato? Tato promised that she's gonna log
Hey,
on.
Robin, I see you representing Nova ladies there.
Oh, there's a novel thing as well.
No, it's a Nova thing. She's just representing Nova. No hating.
Okay.
No hater.
No hating. No hating. Love.
Today we're only allowed to hate UCT and only me. Okay. Others are conflicted, so I can say anything about UCT. I'm Wabi. How you doing?
It's 6 o'clock already.
Good.
Dan, you quite smooth as well. What happened to the hair?
Yeah, look, smoother than Denzel,
Some of us have still got the caveman
Why
look.
not? Why not? It's Friday, feeling good. Why not?
Man, fantastic.
All I need is for you to teach me that pose you just made on Facebook.
Oh, that one.
I need to learn that. You see, man, you need to do like a leg thing, right? You need to do like an angle.
Put it up,
Good. Okay. So because we have a jam-packed day, I suggest that we get started, man. What do you think about that?
I think we should. After speaking to Thokozile's got like just fountains and fountains of wisdom, right? And
people need to listen to her.
And guys, well, look, you'll have to suggest to us if you want this to run a bit over, because we are actually just going to keep quiet, and we are just going to let her speak. She's also writing a book. She's like, I mean, what can she not do? She's a doctor. Hey, Dan, go for it, bro.
Dude, she's gonna cure the coronavirus. That's how much doctor she is.
Woo!
We have corona going down tonight. Good. So guys, just for introduction, my name is Dan, very passionate about coaching, mentorship, and leadership development. Manda.
Yeah, my name is Manda, and I am quite passionate about coaching and mentoring. And together with my friend Dan, this is what we do for fun. Can you believe it?
Yeah, this is a lot of fun.
It's like fun,
Especially when we're going down in history for discovering the cure of corona. No virus, no vaccine. We don't care. Vaccine out of the way. Cures right now. We're curing it right now.
Definitely.
Good. So guys, just a reminder again, why we're having the webinar. The webinar is done to really just focus on career pivoting, looking at people who are looking at kind of the process, the thinking, the emotions, the steps, and anything else in between, which will help you actually act on your impulse to pivot upwards, sideways, the leap into entrepreneurship, all covered in one. We're gonna talk about it. We're gonna talk about the mindset of a person who actually pivots, really focusing on inspiring you guys to actually act on them. And maybe just a quick testimony. This past week, I had a testimony of somebody who kind of just went through this program and has gotten to a stage where they are having a day-to-day relationship with a sponsor. So they have a bi-monthly session with a sponsor, coming from a sponsor, from somebody 6 weeks ago didn't even know the sponsor is, to having a board sponsor. And I thought that was very exciting.
Yeah, massive.
Looking forward to hearing how people are actually pivoting. That's the stuff we'll be actually focusing on
Mm,
going forward. Quickly into the housekeeping. It's a webinar, so we're not going to allow everyone to speak. It'll be only the three of us. So if you're irritated with us, sorry, you need to listen to us for an hour. You can chat with us later on. You can DM us and stuff like that. We're cool with that. We're asking you guys to go in the chat. Please put your story in the chat. Tell us where you're from. What are the issues which are coming out which you find very interesting? Anything else, just get the chat popping, making sure that we keep the conversation live. Ask all the questions in the Q&A. This lady can answer all your questions. She's really smart. She has a PhD, so she's smart.
Yeah.
Any question, ask her about who's going to win the American election. Boom, to have the answer right there.
She will tell you. And Dan, you know, it's not just any PhD, right? It was quite a fast track one, but you know, let's what do we know? We're not doctors, you know. Yeah, we're just regular guys, you know.
Good. All right, over
but
to
guys,
you,
so yeah, let's get the discussions going. And if maybe Thokozile says something amazing, please put it there, capture it for us. Let's share it. We also have the Facebook page running. Please go there and like the page. We will put announcements there. By the way, all this is being recorded, so it'll be available on YouTube. So don't feel like you have to write notes as if you are like a first year student doing microbiology at UCT.
Can't compare. There's only one.
I think focus, absorb in the discussion, and let's see what we can take coming out of this. Q&A, there is a Q&A button on my screen. It's somewhere on the bottom there. So please put your questions there so that we can have them organized, so that we can make sure that they are answered. Thokozile will also be seeing the questions. Some of the questions we'll see how we answer them as we go along. And there is no commercial interest that we are receiving from this webinar. But however, we would like to thank our generous sponsors, Biotechnologies Africa, the biggest technology company on the continent.
I recognize.
And also the lady who does all our posters. I mean, you can see they're spectacular. It's Mandisa, right?
Mandisa
Buthelezi.
Mandisa, she
please.
Made Thokozile look like Miss Africa. There, boom. She was feeling herself.
So please, Thokozile, I'm sure you are on. Please put your contact details. Oh, sorry, I mean Mandisa. Mandisa, I'm quite confused. It's clearly
I'm happy
Friday.
to be her agent, Manda. Happy to be her agent.
And believe me, this is tea. This is all that I'm drinking. Mandisa, please put your contact details there. So if anyone wants to reach out to you and has opportunities for you, there we go. And anybody out there, if you'd like to contribute in here, maybe you want to, you like great at doing film and all that, we're happy to have any advice that you can give us. But before I hand back to Dan, let's just do a mood check. How is everyone feeling? There is a panel, polls have just come up. Please just tick your option. Very excited, need a pick me up, and indifferent.
Cool. Okay, so usually around this time we do a word of wisdom, but in front of this qualified, ordinary, super intelligent lady, I think
my goodness,
don't really deserve to waste everyone's time. She has all the wisdom you ever need in one person. So what we do is we go into introduction. Now, my introduction to this lady is very simple because we want to really get into her. Very, very simple. We sat and listened to this lady for 2 hours. Boom. Thokozile, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. I must say, Dan and Manda, you're very naughty. Yeah, you actually. It's quite intimidating to like open my mouth and now shatter everyone's illusions. But I thank you so much for your generous descriptions. I never take our compliments lightly, and they always reaffirming to know that once you've met people, interacted with people, they felt they took something away that they could enrich themselves with. So as
2 hours of it, zoop, and I can shut up. You made me shut up.
Right, and since the two of you know me, and the people who also know me or have connected with me on LinkedIn know that I describe my purpose and the thing that makes me tick. I say I exist to inspire and empower, and those are that they've always been true about me, and I'm fortunate enough to have built a career around that concept as well. So I'm really, really excited to be on. I see a lot of my friends, some of them from like way back in school, recent connections as well, colleagues I've met through work from like Zambia, Ireland. I see people from Mauritius. So it's really, truly happy to be able to connect on a global level, because you know, the great thing about being human is, you know, being human is a bit of a common experience. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion and quite excited.
Good.
So when I
tell us, where did it start?
So, you know, when I reflected on career pivots, right? I think I've had 4 significant career pivots. I've had 1 career shock. I wouldn't call it a pivot. I'd call it a bit of a COVID. Okay. And I would say right now I'm in a career pivot, right? So it's about 5. So I'd like to start my story at my first career pivot. So I was a typical bright African child. I think for most African children who are on the other side of the 40s, they can relate to the fact that when we were growing up, right? If you were good in school, you were groomed to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, right? So I belonged to the doctor camp, right? My father was a lawyer.
Engineer right here, engineer.
But yeah, my father was a lawyer, but he felt if I started with law, I'd be wasting my brains. So better to try the doctor thing. So I made my way to the University of Zambia and started in the med quota. And in the first years, it's not pure medical subjects. You're kind of mixed with other natural science students. And here I discovered, you know, microbiology, biochemistry, all this stuff for me that was very intriguing, because as a child, I had always wanted to be a public health official. Okay, that's what I wanted to do, because I wanted that UN number plate. I don't know if you had that, if you remember that. You know, it's the diplomats in the UN, and they would be in their UN number plates. And I had this vision of them as these are the people who, you know, solve the world's problems. Yeah, I grew up as a child with a lot of community service in my life. So I've always been attracted to education-based stuff or food security or healthcare-based initiatives, because I'm Catholic, and that's a big part of growing up in the Catholic Church. My parents were Rotarian, so that was like a big part of also grooming my interest. So when I arrived in Ginza, I started, you know, you discover more. First of all, I didn't even know what microbiology was, right? When I arrived there. And in that experience at UNZA, I started to stick out a little bit. And the thing that I started to stick out on was the fact that the subjects that the medical students had to like suffer because they were compulsory, but really not, you know, directly related to medical subjects, is the stuff like I loved, right? I loved biology. I loved all of that. And I would ask questions. I would try to do a little bit more than was asked, because I was so intrigued, you know, about understanding organisms at a micro level. And literally we had a test once, and the combined class had 125 students. In this 125 students, I was the one student who had an A, right? Now, this was very unusual, apparently, because apparently the med students never really bothered with these classes, but I was like completely high on it. And our professor, Professor Kapuria at the University of Zambia at the time, he called me to his office and he asked me, you know, what is it that you want to do with your life? You know, because you're a bit not the typical medical student, you know, do you want to be a doctor? Like, tell me a little bit. So I explained to him, I was like, no, not really. I'll do public health, but I figure I have to do this as a path to that. He was like, no, you actually don't. And you can actually do this sort of work. But when I think about your potential and your brain and the questions you ask, and when I look at the facilities we have at UNZA, if your parents can afford to send you to school in South Africa, I think, chat to your parents about that, and so he opened my mind, to the possibility that there are other, there are other ways in which I could actualize my vision. And the thing I would like focus on about that is I get asked a lot by people, how do you find your purpose? Like, what's my purpose? Do I search for it? Etc. And honestly, your purpose and your vision are not fixed, and they tend to expand with the more that you learn, right? I think a lot of people haven't realized that the reason people always encourage you to read books, be curious, etc., is just because it expands your perspective, of what you see, because it's hard to imagine something that you've never seen. That's why role modeling is powerful, right? And that's why we try to shove, all these sort of role models in front of children, because it gives this, it just gives you knowledge that this is possible, and that's what this is called, So obviously I took Professor Kapuria's advice, and I went to talk to my dad, right? Now my dad, like, bless his soul, he was an educated man, but he was a lawyer, I think by the time he was already a judge. So all my dad said was like, molecular what? Right? Like,
yeah.
And if I think back, this is like, what was that? This was like, I think it was 1999 or 2000. I got my PhD. My dad still could not pronounce molecular, so it didn't help 6 years, but he basically, in that moment, he was like, but why would you do that when you can be a doctor, right? And so I tried to explain to him, but it was a bit of a losing battle, right? So I changed the tactic. So I said to him, what's so important about being a doctor anyway, And for him, he said, for him, it's a good use of my talent, right? Because my dad, like, I think all parents, think their kids are like so bright, right? And I realized that I had to give him a bit of an education on what molecular and cell biology was, but also what the possibilities were for a career. So I sat him down and I explained to him that, if I study this, it doesn't mean I'm going to end with 1 degree, right? I will still have the opportunity to either get a master's degree or a PhD, etc. And then he said to me that I will allow you to do it on one condition, right? And I was like, what's the condition? And his condition was that if you're going to do it, you have to be excellent and you have to go all the way, right? He can then feel that I've lived up to his potential, right? And if I just pause on that for a moment, look, as I reflect back, right, I think there were 3 things that really shaped that moment of pivot, that are worth reflecting on. I think the first one is the openness to listen to Professor Kapuria, right? And the curiosity to not hold too rigidly to what I thought, the path that I was on, but to actually embrace, like a new possibility. And I think sometimes, because I obviously have also mentor and coaching conversations, I think sometimes we are too fixed in how we have imagined our lives. And some of the stuckness in the moment comes more from just being fixed and too married, to what and too married to your idea, life should be or what you should do. So I think for me, it was great that I was very young, right? And I think when you're young, you're a little bit less open. You're a little bit more open. You're a little bit less full of yourself. And I think at that time, my youth really served me well, right? And I adored Kapuria, so I was open to him, right? But I also think sometimes I've had experiences with my own friends, that they're bashing their head trying to, do this version of themselves, and it may not be working out, and they're not as open to the fact that maybe there are more possibilities for them, So I think it's a critical thing to think about, like when you're in that moment of pivot and you're just fixated on one option, you would do well to, explore beyond the option. And that's the benefit of reading and watching videos and that sort of thing. I think the second for me is I was very lucky to have a father who was not very draconian, right? And he entertained trained me. Yeah. I was also a bit of a daddy's girl. So I knew how to manipulate him.
Wrap around the finger. I know about that.
Exactly. Dude, it
I've
wasn't
got a
around the
9-month who's done that to me.
No, I was literally wrapped around the whole hand. Yeah, not the finger, the whole hand.
Oh, the whole hand. Okay.
Absolutely. Right. And I think it's important also to acknowledge grace. Okay. So you can tell from my language, I am Christian, right? I have a belief system. And I think most people have a belief system. And I do think that I was very fortunate to have the parents that I did, you know, and I've had like 2.5 sets, and I always reflect on the grace of my dad. And the one thing that it always brings me back to is that the same way one right conversation can set you on a path, right? Like if you think about Professor and me, right? Just that one conversation called me to his office and said, oh, well done on doing that A, you know, being the only A in the class, and it could have ended there, right? But it didn't, right? In that, like, a life can change in a single conversation, you know, but both positively and negatively. And if I look at it on the flip side, right? Because I'll talk about this in some of my other pivots, is sometimes you can actually allow a single negative conversation, you know, to actually just change your life and put you into, you know, paralysis, right? It's important to remind ourselves that it's just one conversation, right? It's just one perspective, you know? So as I reflect back on it, I was like, you know what? If you're in a moment of like pivot and you're trying to think through big decisions, you need to be intentional about surrounding yourself with dreamers, you know, people who are optimistic, people who can see more for you, or people who are on the same path. You don't want to be that person who is like in a bunch of friends and you're very, you know, you're quite mediocre, but because you're the least mediocre, you find yourself celebrating being the tallest dwarf. Yeah, because you're still a dwarf. You know what I mean? So I guess what I want to focus on is, in these moments, you have to be intentional about putting the most positive energy, like-minded people around you. You know, for me in that moment, it happened by accident with, or by God's intelligent design with Professor Kapuria, you know, and with my dad. But we can also be, you know, we can have agency to create those moments, you know, for ourselves. And then I guess the last thing around that particular pivot was, you know, you have to have courage to step into the unknown, right? When a little bit about some of my later pivots, I was less, you know, that youthful naivety, right? For me, it's like the big adventure, because I was like, oh, I'm going to go to UCT. I went on the web, I saw the mountain and the pictures and the beach, you know, I'm from Zambia, like my darling land or country. It was all about curiosity and enthusiasm, right? And I was like that in my youth, right? I was that kid, you know, in school, you just try to do everything, try to be everything, you know, and I guess if you speak to my husband, he'll think I'm still that adult, right? But I think when I was younger, I really leaned into my curiosity, right? And that served me very well then, but as an adult, because experiences, right, shape your perspective. And I've had experiences where I've jumped into things and like had that total slap, right? And that makes us as adults start to develop armor, risk aversion, stuff like that. And what I find is, now that I'm older, I have to be more intentional, you know, about cultivating, you know, curiosity, you know, etc. So if I give a small example, you know, if you're in a moment where you're trying to make a very dramatic life decision, right, you might want to experiment with a smaller dramatic decision. So for some people, you know, being an adult and going into a swimming pool, even a swimming pool that's like maybe at waist height, is terrifying, right? Because they've never done it before, right? But perhaps, right, if you actually went to a pool, right, and got inside the swimming pool, you're going to start to train your brain, right, to be able to take risks, right? And you can nurture those sorts of things. So I think that pivot for me from UCT to, from UNZA, the University of Zambia, to UCT.
Yeah.
I think the big thing there was really around the social context, right? The importance of your social context. In my instance, people saw me as a medical doctor. That's all they knew. I think a lot of people could relate to that. Probably people studied things they hate, Sometimes you still wonder why you studied that, but it was because the social construct around you glorified that, right? And you were pushed towards that maybe because you're smart. Right? And I think from my own experience, what I'm trying to say is, oftentimes, though we feel victim to those things, the people who are visiting those things on us, they have their best intentions. And we have to be more proactive in educating them, you know, into the new possibilities, and almost like, you know, enrolling them as our cheerleaders, you know, towards our, you know, our new possibilities and the things that we want.
Yeah, fantastic. So Thokozile, you come to this beautiful Cape Town, beautiful mountain. Well,
Yeah.
Dan does not, he does not know about it. You know, we were sold the myth that you going to UCT is going on holiday, but anyway, that's a story for another day. But you arrived there, right?
Yeah.
And how is the experience? Is this everything you expected? I mean, the brochures, I mean, I'm sure they were even taking those pictures by helicopter. There were no drones back then. You know, you've come to this big, wonderful place with all the facilities, as your professor has told you. What happens and how do you find it?
Oh, my favorite UCT memory, like one of my favorites, and I tell it often, right, is going to UCT was literally like the village cousin, you know, visiting New York. It was hilarious. So you have to understand, in Zambia, at the time, we had only one university for science, yeah? So if you had gotten into science and into the med quota, you know, you were a little full of yourself and you really felt like, oh, I'm a superstar, right? And when I arrived at UCT, you know, I was like in superstar mode, right? I was confident, etc. Went to this lecture. When I sat in the lectures, I was, you know, I knew what they were saying because Yunza was a little bit advanced at that stage, you know, so I was feeling very smart and it was great. And then in the second week, it was the first week of practicals, right? Now, if you've ever heard of imposter syndrome. So we, you know, had our coats, we went into our lab, and I walked into the lab and I looked around and I was like, whiskey, tango, foxtrot, right? Because it's just like, where am I? I literally felt probably the way people feel the first time they put on virtual reality glasses, right? I was looking at this equipment, I couldn't recognize anything, right? Even the little glass cylinders looked like fancy, you know, and things. And the department only had, I think there were 8 Black people, you know, we had about 80 students in our cohort, but there were only 8 Blacks. So you can imagine, first of all, like women wasn't that common. And then you're Black and you're like, I'm Black. I'm from like Zambia, which is like third world compared to SA. And now I must be shown up to not know what the heck I'm doing. You know, I looked around and thank goodness they made us work in pairs, right? So I looked around and I was like, oh my goodness, can I see someone who's not yet paired up? And there was this white student, you know, very vocal, like chatting, etc. And I heard from her accent that she's an exchange student because she sounded American. So I ran up to her and I was like, hi, have you found a partner? And she was like, oh no, I haven't joined up. So I said to her, great. So I said to her, you know what? Why don't you get our equipment ready? And I'll go and collect all the reagents and I'll do the calculations. And she was like, oh, really? You're going to do that? Awesome. Because I'm terrible at calculations. And then I say to her, it's like, no, don't worry, I've got you. Right. And I literally spent the next 2 weeks watching her and figuring out how this stuff works. And I never forget that moment, because I think for a lot of us, when we place ourselves into new situations, particularly if you are coming from a place of expertise and a place of prestige, right? In your career, however you've defined yourself now, when you're looking to reinvent yourself, you're almost like starting at ground zero and vulnerable, right? I wasn't waiting for everyone to know that, you know, alleged superstar is clueless on all this lab equipment. But I think you do have to be proactive in figuring out how can I work my way out of my fear, and hopefully in a way that allows me, you know, to retain my dignity. Because for me, it was very important. I was very proud of being Zambian, right? And I always used to defend when we talk about our economy, you know, or all these Zimbabweans who would say like, you know, make fun of our currency. Boy, was I happy when the Zimbabwean dollar tanked. I had my moments back, right? Right?
I'm assuming I'm assuming Simba wasn't in the picture.
Yeah, because I mean, by the way, for the audience, Thokozile's husband is from Zim, so
Yes.
I wonder how this conversation went down.
No, but I guess what I just want to focus on is, in that moment, a lot of people ask me, oh, but you're so confident. When I was young, I think I just managed it well, right? I think there are very times where I physically showed either how out of depth I felt, etc. I mean, if I move on to my other pivot from UCT, so I had a great time at UCT, right? Got my PhD.
But before you do that, Thokozile, what is managing well? What does that mean? You managed it well.
So in the moment, so for me, managing well, right? So what managing well looked like to me was, first of all, I had to own the fact that I was having a whiskey tango foxtrot moment, right? I also had to own the fact that I'm actually capable of learning, like there's so much stuff in this world that I've learned that I didn't know. And I always like to take people back to the example of driving a car, right? Can you remember the first time you tried to drive a car when you got inside? Didn't you think that why are there suddenly so many more buttons and things than when I'm a You know what I mean? Like, I think we all had that, right? So why is it looking so complicated? When the people are driving, it's like, now it's like gears and you have to go in sequence and like all of that stuff. I always try to bring myself back to that moment, right? Is that there are things in life where I've been a novice, but I've learned my way to mastery. So in that moment, I have to always remind myself, learning is actually natural, right? And out of your depth, when you're confronted with something new, it's completely natural. I mean, look at COVID, now I'm having Zoom parties and celebrations as if they're normal, right? The first time we try to plan it, you're like, oh my goodness, will we even talk? Will anyone laugh? But now it's the new normal and it's only a few months. So I do think it's important to remind yourself in that moment that it's normal. I think that
Thokozile, I'd like us to maybe... Okay.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say, I think the second thing is you have to also be smart about who you're vulnerable to, right? So so if you don't trust people, okay, and if you have the option, find someone who you feel you trust and be vulnerable to them first. It's always easier to be vulnerable first in spaces where we feel accepted, right? And if you are vulnerable there first and you have the conversation there first, that can actually help you get over stuff enough to then actually have the conversation in a space where you feel less safe, so that's also very important because people sometimes feel like, oh, I don't trust my boss. Can I tell do I have to tell my boss? It's like, but you don't have to talk to your boss, right? You could either start first with your partner or with your friend, or with someone from HR or the ombud, you know what I mean? So I do think you can also take steps towards disclosure. You don't have to put yourself into that moment of like terror and complete panic immediately. What did you want to say, Manda?
No, I wanted to say that you talked about how your prof had a big influence in your direction. And when we were having the call earlier this week, you spoke about how you realized something, particularly in some of your students, because here's the thing. When you think about microbiology back then, it was like, it sounds too much like a subject in high school. So we definitely did avoid it. But the few people of color who might have come into this environment and probably did not have the same insight as you, how did you play a part in helping them succeed?
Yeah, so when I came to UCT, right? So I went to a girls' school in Zambia called Fatima. It's quite a famous school for being dirt cheap, but producing high quality, graduates, etc. It's owned by Dominican nuns, and that's the model. So I was used to, everyone like, getting high marks and competing, and UNZA was even worse, Can you imagine a country with only one university? By the time you go there, the people who actually have a chance to get into the university, people are pretty much high performing. When I arrived at UCT, I had another moment that I've never forgotten, right? We had written a test in biochemistry, and at the time UCT had this habit of putting, marks up on a wall with your name on it, and then they would put the marks in descending order. So the highest grades would be at the top and then the lowest. And when I walked into the building, everyone was like huddled, you know, by the notice board. And I asked what's going on. And they said, oh, the biochemistry results are out. So I walked towards the board, and there was a student of mine, in the same cohort, who had her finger by my name. And then she goes, who's this? Right? So now, obviously, being new to South Africa, I had my Steve Biko on. And I was like, okay, so who's this? You know? And when they moved away, right, I didn't confront her, but I was offended, right? So I was like, what does she mean, who's this? Right? And when they moved away, I then realized that in the test, I can't remember, I either got the second or third highest mark in the class, and then pretty much all the other Black student names were towards the bottom of the list. And this was for me very surprising, right? And over time, I realized that the other Black students at the time, they were South African students at the time, didn't get very high marks, right? But they seemed to be kind of okay. You know, they were happy to pass. Now, for me, this was odd because I guess I was groomed to be like, you know, it's like 80% or nothing, you know, or 90%. And I couldn't understand why they're not so bothered, you know, or maybe would celebrate being in the 50s or 60s. But as I got to understand the South African context better, right? And I got to appreciate the schooling system they came from and all of that. And just frankly, the hurdles they had to overcome, right? To even get that far. For me, I was like inspired to make it part of my personal, I guess, project or crusade to help be part of that journey to make them actually achieve even more, right? And I think because I never doubted for a second that they could actually do it, it was just that, you know, that motivation or support or tutoring or stuff like that, you know, and I realized later in life when I did leadership development work on myself to figure out my purpose was that when I was a little kid and I first went to a private school for primary school, I would come back home. My mom had bought me a board that I had in our garage, and I'll spend the afternoon teaching all the other kids in my neighborhood who went to public school, you know, what I'd learned in my fancy school. You know, my mom had bought me books, everything. I was like playing teacher, you know, and I was about 8. You know, I did this all the way up to before I went to Fatima, but that's how I was, right? Because I'd been in a public school. And then when I went to this private school, I was like, oh my God, you know, the things they taught you were so different. You know, there was only one Black teacher at the school who was the music teacher, you know, so that was also like, oh, you know what I mean? And this is in Zambia, right? In the UK, this was in Zambia, in the mine schools. But already, I think because of the values of my parents of being generous and stuff like that, for me as a child, I went now from, I used to always give people food across the fence, you know, like because sometimes some of my friends, they wouldn't have food. So I was always that kid, you know, just grab stuff from the kitchen, and my mom was okay with it. But then I started to run like my little school, and I found myself, I was actually at UCT, that we almost like, we really bonded. We were a tight unit. And at the end of the day, pretty much all of those people in my class that we were with have completed their PhDs, and they're all like distinguished teachers, etc. And it's very important for me, and it's been a life lesson to live a life of abundance. I never meet people and think that what I'm seeing is all that they are, right? Because no, right?
Please repeat that. Please repeat that.
What I said was, when I meet people, right, from today, it's very easy for me to realize that what I'm seeing and the person that I'm speaking to is not a representation of all that this person could be. Right? Not a representation of everything this person has inside of them. Okay, because if we're to be honest, right, human beings are the most abundant creatures on earth, right? So even for people thinking about, you know, their careers or, you know, what it is they're studying, what you studied is just what you bothered to find out about now, right? It is in no way a representation of a limit of your capacity to study. You know, it's exactly the same thing with a job, right? Every job you've had is just a choice you made. Right? You could have made different choices, right? There's nothing about who you are today, right? That is definitive of who you could be tomorrow, you know, and I firmly believe that, right?
Yeah.
And I am fortunate to have had a couple of life experiences that actually showed me that, right? Because I had people who are like barely making 50 and they've gone on to be, you know, like proper scientists, right? And not like scientists at some backwater university, right? They've actually gone on to be in Ivy League or fancy British universities, etc. So, you know, I would always like to give that reminder to, you know, the people on the call with us or anyone who ever listens to this later, is that who you are today is just a journey of the number of days you've had till today, right? It doesn't define who you could be tomorrow. And I think it's always important to remember that, you know.
And you didn't let your choice of microbiology define you, right? So here you are getting to the end of your PhD, and you know, you were probably thinking that you are going to be stuck in a lab somewhere.
We'll be solving Corona in 2020.
You're not solving Corona in 2020. What happened?
So you know, it's quite funny. Everyone who knew me when I was a student, they always say, yeah, we knew it would never last. But honestly, when I was studying what I studied, I loved it, right? I got the chance to be exposed to HIV vaccine research. You know, I was making drought-tolerant strains of maize. I was working on probiotics. So really things that I really believed would change lives, yeah? So in that moment, right? And I always emphasize this to people, right? Is that in that moment, I would have told you I'm going to be a scientist for the rest of my life when I was in that moment, right? As soon as I started doing a postdoc, I then realized, oh my goodness, can I do research for 15 years before I change, like do something significant? And I was like, I'm not that person. I don't think I am, you know? And I think, is it Sheryl Sandberg in her book, Lean In, she said, for women, who you marry is very important, right? I'm going to give testimony to say who you date is equally important, right?
A discussion for another day. There's been some cycles up there. So let's move on that one. Let's leave it to who you marry.
Honestly, because my husband, who was then my boyfriend, now look at me, right? I'm an academic, right? I'm a scientist, and I'm academic, and I'm unfulfilled, right? So what was my ultimate thing? Okay, I'm going to do an MBA because maybe I should look at this business side. But my roots to the MBA was I should do, you know, I'm going to do my route into business was I'm going to do an MBA. And Simber, goodness, right? Haven't you studied enough? Right? He said, there's this thing called McKinsey. They're always looking for little clever things like you, you know, and I had no idea what McKinsey was. And we went onto the website, and again, you know, for me, an act of grace. The first website that I went on, because McKinsey has several, the first McKinsey website I went on was showcasing the fact that McKinsey had done I think it was the ARV rollout in Uganda for free, right? Okay. And for me, I come from a family, both sides, my maternal and paternal family, where we have had a significant impact of HIV/AIDS in our family, right? From the early days till today, it's way better because I have family members who live with HIV/AIDS and it's so normal. But back in the day, it was terrifying, you know? And the thought of working for a company that could do that, right? I was sold, right? And when I then found out that, oh, you can get into McKinsey without having a business degree, right? That they deliberately recruit 50% non-business. I went to the writing center. I said, can you help me turn my academic CV into this thing called skills-based CV? Because I Googled it. And the writing center helped me. And long story short, I got into McKinsey. But what is interesting about McKinsey, my personal experience of McKinsey, and this is what I'd like to dwell on as a lesson, right? Is that when I went to McKinsey, I interviewed, in fact, the first interview, I was in Cape Town, they called me to say, you have to come to Joburg. Okay, and then they said, you have to find your own way, right? So I was like, I can't find my way. I don't have money. How will I get there? So I said to them, no, then it's fine, right? So then they said, okay, we'll get back to you. but they called me back and they bought the ticket. I was like, yes, you know, and it was in a hotel, you know, complete with like the chocolate. I wrote this test, which I found completely biased, and I wrote all over the test, you know, telling them how it's biased against people who haven't started business. They need to do better. I'm very full of myself. I went back to Cape Town. I got invited back for the second round. I had the interviews again. On my way, I flew back to Cape Town, and when I landed at the airport, Simba was there. We had bumped into his aunt and uncle at the airport, and I received the call then at the airport before I'd even gone, you know, to offer me the job. And I was excited, right? But the thing that's important about my particular McKinsey story, when I started to tell people that I'm leaving to go to McKinsey, is when I found out everyone else had tried but failed to get in. So other people had known about McKinsey. They'd never said anything to me. I was just so grateful. I was so grateful that I had no clue on what a big deal it was to get into McKinsey. And the reason for that gratitude is, you know, knowledge can be as imprisoning as it can be empowering. And in that moment, you know, not having any, you know, limiting mindsets, not having any, you know, issues about, am I good enough? It served me well. I showed up.
Thokozile,
I completely showed up.
In our prep, you spoke about something. I even wrote it down here. I've got a, this is not just so you said, where is it now? Man, you said sometimes mindsets can hold you back. What did you mean by that?
Oh, completely. You know, if you have the wrong mindset, I think one of the worst ways in which mindsets hold us back is they actually make us not try. And the thing for me is we have to live our life not according to our fears, but according to our facts, okay? And one fact I can tell you as a statistician, right, since you're all trying to make a big deal about me being a scientist, is that for everything that you've never tried, your chances of success are equal to your chances of failure. So what do you have to lose? I think times, you know, we create our own limiting statistics, right? Just because you've never done it before, you start to have a conversation with yourself like, oh, this is 90% failure, 10% failure. And I can't remember who said this quote. It might be Sheryl Sandberg. I really can't remember who said it, but the author said, you know, in any career, you either succeed or learn. There's no such thing as failure. And if you can inculcate those sorts of mindsets to say, you know what, I'm going to try, right? And the reason I'm going to try is because I will remember in this moment, the chances of success are equal to the chances of failure. I have to lose, right? And you lean into it. But also, when you are in that moment, and I like to always remind myself this, and this is especially true because of just the way brain neurology works. A human brain processes fear only one way, okay? Because when we process fear and threats through the amygdala, it's a very primitive part of the human system. So what that means is that if I open this door, right, and there's a spitting cobra waiting on its tail for me, the level of emotional reaction and fear I will have, right, is equal to when my boss, right, loses their wig, right, and comes and shouts at me about bad performance. Now, one of those situations is life-threatening, okay? The other one, maybe my boss's life will be under threat, right? But the way a human being processes emotion, right, it's not regulated, right? And that's important because when you are scared, right, you really will feel like that decision is a life and death one, right? Sometimes we don't do things because they're like, but I could fail, right? And I always try to remind myself, but so what if I fail, right? Not die.
Good.
Then you could choose something else.
Yeah, I think we need to move it forward because we're running out of time. I want to go to my case but just make a comment. I always tell people who I mentor that, you know, courage is literally your faith or your belief in the face of fear. So it's not that you're not afraid, but you're actually going to face the fear somehow and believe something positive will actually come out. And that's what courage is. I know people say courage is the absence of fear. There's nothing like that. Everyone is good. And Mackenzie now, you're glamorous.
Yeah, and by the way, Thokozile, because I see Toa is telling us that we need to move. She's like managing us very, very. She knows that we're a bit ungovernable done. But I think let's then move from you now in McKinsey. You know, you've started working.
Oh yes.
Well,
so
you now decided to you decide to go into corporate.
Yeah.
What inspired that decision?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about two pivots in McKinsey because I think the two pivots are important. When I was in McKinsey, I was successful. I was a generalist consultant. I was one of the few women, one of the few Black women, one of the few Black women in a relationship, you know, so things were really going well. And right? Any consultant can testify. I had a in fact, Alinafe can testify because she's on this call, right? That was quite an achievement. So anyway, so when I was in McKinsey, I realized that for me, people seemed to be the factor by which projects succeeded or failed, right? And I wanted to understand why that was, okay? So McKinsey is very smart, a lot of IQ, you know, lot of collateral framework, name the name, if you say, call a framework 5D, 5S, 7F, there's a McKinsey framework, right?
Yeah, no, Dan has drunk the juice. He speaks.
There we go.
I love him.
He's drunk the Kool-Aid.
But what I discovered was it actually didn't matter how intelligent the solution was. If the leadership, right, weren't on board or didn't buy in or drive it correctly, or if the employees didn't own it, etc., things always fell apart. So I started intrigued by this aspect, right, and said, I actually want to focus on that, because that's where the true impact happens. I was a little bit frustrated in having seen some projects fail. So I then made the decision in McKinsey to say, I want to specialize in organization work. Now, organization work, you know, is sort of fancy speak for HR, okay? So I then said, when I shared this, both with my mentor, okay, and some of my colleagues, here's the reaction. And I'm not making this up. This is an actual quote. And there's a reason I've never forgotten it, right? They're like, oh, but you're so smart. Can you imagine?
Wow.
You've shared a purpose, a dream with someone, and they're like, but aren't you like smarter than that? Like, why do you waste your potential on that? You know, and I promise you, again, by the grace of God, I had already started to specialize in leadership development work. I was able to recognize that they are speaking from their best perspective. Right? So for them, HR, you know, is a downgrade. And because they see me as someone who can achieve so many things, those two things in their mind don't work. Yeah? Which is that the HR career and then so much intelligence. You know what I mean? And I thank God always that I had people around me, but enough training to recognize that sometimes when people don't back you, it's not because they're terrible. It's that they don't get it, you know? And I think that's important, right? So yes, tell people about your dreams, seek input, etc., but also don't be quick to write people off, you know, or to doubt yourself, you know, because someone else doesn't, you know, get your vision, right? There's a reason it's yours, right? You were brought into the world for something, right? And it's great if people affirm you, etc., but you have to believe in your own sort of unique reason for being and play into that. The second McKinsey pivot came with the other COVID shock, right? So the COVID shock for most women is young children, and it changes your priorities in your career. I think most working mothers attest to this. We all go through this phase where, particularly soon after giving birth, there's no world besides this little child of mine, you know, and it causes you to rethink your priorities, etc. And I was clear, I did not want to be a partner, consultant. In fact, I even went as far as dreaming what at the time was my worst nightmare, that I would come home and my little daughter one day would say her first word, and it would be Eunice, which was the name of the nanny. right? This is like a thing for me. You know, it sounds funny, but I dreamt it, right? So when I was seeking to do that pivot from management consulting to corporate, in my instance, there were some things I had that were going for me, right? So the fact I had a McKinsey brand, which I knew was high collateral. So I knew I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't suffer to attract opportunities. I'd already had some clients, you know, approach me for work, etc. But the thing at the time that I think a lot of people can relate to is when you achieve success in something, particularly in something where it's unusual to be successful, right? And I think that's the sort of brand McKinsey has. Like, oh, you survived McKinsey, oh, for so long, right? Because McKinsey is very open about being an up or out culture, right? If you don't make it, they kind of show you out, right? In a great way, because McKinsey alumni go on to do great things. But the thing for me was, okay, so I was great as a scientist, right? And then I've been great at McKinsey, right? Now the third time, isn't that like maybe too much luck? You know, in that moment, my biggest fear was, what if I bomb? You know, and I'm leaving this job that people are dying to have, right? And I'm saying, oh no, I'm going corporate, blah, blah. You know, first of all, what if I hate it? Okay, which is a reality. But if I bomb, right? And then I'll be like, oh yeah, you know, she had two tries and then she'll fail. And that was a real fear for me, you know. And I think, again, I'm lucky to be in leadership development work, because as I spoke to my people and my mentor, etc., I had to again remind myself, right? And the two things that I always tend to come back to in these moments, the first one is the chance of success is equal to the chance of failure, okay? So thinking that I may fail is not a logical reason to not do something. The second reminder was, when I arrived at McKinsey, my first study was on private equity, right? When I got the call, oh, you've been staffed on a piece, it's private equity in Nigeria, you know, the staffing person. I was like, oh, thanks, I'm so excited. When does it go? Blah, blah, blah. I hung up the phone and I was like,
I had no idea.
Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what is private equity? Yeah. And I had to Google it. Because again, similar to UCT, right? I wasn't about to ask her on the phone to say, what is this? What if she thinks, what have we hired if she doesn't know what private equity is? You know what I mean? So I had to remind myself that I've been there before. And a lot of us have been there before, you know? And you should always remind yourself, whenever you feel out of your depth, whenever you feel like you can't do something, look at yourself. The stuff that you are able to do today, you weren't born that way, right? You learned. Right? But what was maybe different was you didn't stop yourself from learning. So try to remember that in those moments. Do a journal. What are all these things I thought were impossible that have actually changed? You know, for a lot of women, I'm actually a wife who's never killed a husband. Write that down. It's an accomplishment. You know what I mean? It's the hardest job in the world.
and Thokozile, look, I want us to maybe just double click on that, because you talked about how you have had to spend time, you know, building the right thinking, building the right perspectives, and we can hear in some of the points that you're making. Can you maybe just, as we prepare to go to the Q&A, take us into that stuff? Because I can imagine a lot of the people attending are people who are also thinking about making their own pivots. And what are some of the actions they can take to start working on preparing their minds, you know, not to bomb on them?
Okay, great. I see a great question from Denver. Hey, Denver, I'm so excited you're here. It's a good friend of mine that I'll answer in a second. I think if I'm going to be practical, right, in advising people who are in a moment of pivot, I would say, start with what gives you joy, okay? Be curious about the things that you care about. Be curious about the things you enjoy, right? Whether it's in your home life, you know, almost do a perspective exercise where go back to your childhood, try and remind yourself, you know, when I was a child and I was free and I did have so many fields, what was it I enjoyed? You know, what was it that I was good at? You know, go back to your work and school years, you know, early work. What is it that I enjoyed? What gave me joy? What came naturally? What are my strengths? What have people always told me, you know, that's great about me. And then when you're now in the present, say, what is it that's attracting me? You know, like, what do I enjoy, etc. Don't think about a job yet, right? Just think about you, right? So be curious about yourself. Be curious about your joy. Be curious about your strengths. I believe that if you reflect on that deeply, right, something is going to start to emerge for you. You're going to start to join the dots, right? And for me, examination and leaning into joys, strength, and passion often point you towards the sort of work you would find purposeful, right? I would say that's where you should always start. I think you should always start with figuring out what is it that makes your heart sing, okay? After that, then have the commercial conversation, right? Okay, when I look at what makes my heart sing, what is the commercial opportunity for that? Okay, that's when we now start to translate it into jobs, right? Jobs, whether it's entrepreneurship, etc. And frankly, in some instances, you'll find that actually what makes my heart sing, I can't quite commercialize successfully. So I'm going to take this job because I need to feed my family, right? So I know I'm doing this job. That's what will drive me. But I'm going to indulge and engage the things that give me purpose and make me happy, because that's what will, you know, keep you energized, etc. So basically what I'm saying is the answer won't always come easily and immediately. And I want to give myself as an example of where I am at the moment, right? Is I've always had this idea that you work, and then when you retire, then you do your passion project. Right? And one of the great things about technology and COVID is COVID actually made me self-examine and say, but what's stopping me? I love my job, right? I'm very fortunate that my job is very closely aligned to my purpose, which is to inspire and empower. But I realized that, no, I can write a book, right? While doing my job. And even better, you know, I can launch my talk show, right? So I've always dreamt of having a talk show, which is like a coaching show, you know? And yeah, so I'm also in a career pivot, which says my pivot is not from this to that. My pivot is an and, right? My pivot is this and this and this. And I think also for people who are in those moments of pivot, think about the and. It's also an option, right? So you don't have to leave the job, right? But maybe you can become more intentional about doing things that make your heart sing. There's one question here from Denver. I get this literally every time, right? Is what have you failed at? You know, and I think it's always, I think people like me who are very optimistic, we always tend to speak about the things that have been great, because I'm naturally not a negative person and I don't dwell on negative things, because ever since I went to McKinsey and I heard this phrase, right? The phrase was, in every upset is a set up for learning, okay? So what that means is life will always come with upsets, right? But you can choose to experience the upset as an upset, or you can dwell on the learning opportunity. So if I missed your question, Denver, is what have I learned? I think the one thing I've learned in the last year in my current job, and it was a massive learning, is that sometimes it's better to be slower and to know and to take everyone along with you. That is actually more effective, you know, than being fast and energetic, etc. I've always been that person. I've always delivered through energy, speed, being a quick thinker and all of that. And last year I had a spectacular bombing, you know, in my performance. It was, you know, it was terrible, etc. But when I then dwelt on the lessons that came out of it, there was some naivety that I had. You know, I'm in a large, complex organization, and it was a great learning for me, you know, that power of sometimes you have to lead more through people than to lead people from the front. You know, so yeah, I think that was the way I had approached some work was colossal failure, you know, if I had to use that language. But for me, it's a life lesson, and I've pivoted, and now I'm working with an expanded reality of how you can bring about impact. It's not always by being that drive cheerleader. You know, sometimes by slowing down the system and doing the little things to help to make the system ready. So that would be an example. Last year was very hard.
Thokozile, I want to make a suggestion. It's 7 now, yeah. So we.
Oh my God, we're over time.
Yeah, we're over time. But what I want to have is that we've got 6 questions.
Okay.
I want to go through them very quickly while people give us the patience to expand. We had kind of already pretty good because you have a lot to say. So if we could do that very quickly.
Yeah.
Sure.
And we've already agreed you're coming again anyway. Because you have a lot of insight. We need to talk about the family and all that, how they fit in, kids. That was a good topic. So, Manda, can you start us up with the questions?
Yeah, the first question comes from Tenjiwe. Tenjiwe says, what do you do to foster your curiosity now that you are older and more advanced in your career?
I have a 7-year-old. That would be my biggest answer. I think my children, so especially the younger one, I think my older daughter, who's a teenager, I know her interests. I lean into my children. I find that they are just a thirst of weird and stuff. So I do think that hanging around with younger, less filtered, less risk-averse generations and people helps. So I do that. I read very widely. So I read everything from the equivalents of Mills and Boone, to hardcore biographies, etc. And that's the thing for me. I love to learn things. And I think learning helps expand your mind and keep you that way. And increasingly, because I'm not naturally a risky person, I have been learning to let go and to take more risks. And I find that they actually pay off. So I actually understand how billionaires are made now. I think it's the world's best kept secret is people become billionaires because they just fail very quickly at different things, not have the answer and it's a one-time thing, so I try to push myself to do things from anything as silly as, I don't know if it's roller skating, etc. But that's how I try to live my life. I try to be intentional about increasing my perspective. So for me, it's reading. I'm introverted, so I'm not that one who does it through meeting a lot of people and chatting. Not that you can't get in touch, but for me, reading is the thing.
You already have, so I'm gonna kill 2 birds in one stone. Rod already has to say, on a personal note, you take offering for mentorship. So I think you can answer it as you go and close and stuff. But
what? On what?
Do you take offers for mentorship? People want you to.
Oh, that's easy. I don't enter into mentorship relationships because I'm not a believer in that. I think mentorship should be intentional and time bound. I do have mentorship conversations. So even when people reach out to me on LinkedIn, I will always commit to at least one conversation to see how I can positively impact a person. And then we can take it from there.
Good. So I've got a question from Tulani. Tulani says, I appreciate your perspective to purpose and to seeing possibility. What would you suggest, what would you suggest as a building block to this perspective you have developed? Is the question clear?
Not really. In terms of how does one gain perspective or how does one, as a building block?
Use the perspective to get a purpose. What are the building blocks to get into some form of purpose?
Oh, okay. I would still say what I said earlier, right? I think your purpose is rooted in things that make you happy. I think your purpose is rooted in the sorts of things you care about. I think your purpose is rooted in your natural strengths, right? And I think the best way is the combination of curiosity and feedback, right? If you're not clear on what you're great at, hopefully you have people around you who you can ask, right? So I would say, I'll give you a simple example. If you're someone who likes to go to the mall and window shop, okay? And you're just that person, you can walk up and down those corridors. I still don't understand how you do that, but maybe you enjoy it, right? Try to be the person that says, not just change one mall to the next mall every weekend, but maybe on one of those weekends, sit in your garden and ask yourself, why am I obsessed with malls? What is it about walking in the mall, that makes my heart sing, right? I would hazard a guess that in that reflective journey, you're actually going to discover something that happens to you when you're in the mall. It's not the malls, right? Something that happens to you in that mall, right? That connects you to something that you care about. So that's what I would say. Be curious about your joys, your strengths, and your passions.
Because that's not good advice. I don't know what my wife is supposed to take from that. So reflection will end up with, this guy needs to up his game. We can't be just walking and window shopping.
Cool. Is that all the questions?
There's two more. So this one comes from Spusiso. He says, to get help in a step forward for the direction you want to take, how do you balance, the vulnerability in order to take the first, or to be the first, to bring your idea across? And how do you become open to receiving feedback or even exposing that idea, even at the possibility of it being stolen? For example, you are telling us now, you are thinking about this show and you've given us the concept, right? Mm-hmm. And it could easily be one person who would want to take it. How do you balance that?
Oh, because I'm the show. There's only one Oprah. So that's what's already been proved. There's only one Oprah, there's only one Beyonce, there's only one Denzel Washington, etc. I promise you, the sooner you understand this, the better. No one will ever be a better you, okay? No one will ever do what you were born to do as brilliantly as you. So you can share your idea with someone, they can try to produce, however many Oprah-like offshoots we've had, but there was only one Oprah. And I think the reason Oprah was so successful is it's completely aligned with who Oprah is, right? Oprah did that stuff almost naturally. There's a lot of work that went into it. So what I would say to the individual who asked the question is the two things I would give as advice. The first one is try open up to people you trust and care about, right? Mm-hmm. Perspective. The second one is also try open up to a total stranger. I have been mind-boggled by the generosity that is on these social media websites, especially LinkedIn, where you see someone and they're interesting and you just send them a note. It's like, oh, wow, I read that thing and that was impressive, and then they'll like reply or connect. And they're never people I would have thought to hear back from. You know what I mean? I'm abundant, so I do that. So I would always tell people, no one can do a better you, okay? So don't approach the world from a point of scarcity. Yeah, because for me, that's a scarcity mindset. Huh? They'll steal it or etc. It won't be good enough. Approach it from a spirit of abundance, because with abundance, one, you'll be like, yeah, they can also try, but I've got my version. The second spirit of abundance is actually speaking to people can actually even make what I'm thinking about better and improve it, right? So there's that. You also need to lean into those positive possibilities and not just the negative. Right? And just Google abundance. There are a couple of free stuff on YouTube. There's a lot of podcasts on how to nurture an abundance mindset. I really, truly believe in that, because I think, like I said before, human beings are capable of such amazing things.
Good. I think on that note, there's a question just came from Tato, just to build on that, which says, top 3 books which talk about life guiding principles you would recommend. Any top 3 books? Top 3 books.
Okay. So I think the first book would be Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He was a Holocaust survivor. And I think he just brings the power of looking at the world through optimism, regardless of your personal situation, into a new perspective, right? So I highly recommend Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I would say The Art of Possibilities by Ben Zander. Is amazing. I think it really will help you think about abundance differently and living from a point of giving everyone a 10, right? Rather than having people have to earn that, and applying that also to yourself. Let me give myself a 10 out of 10. As I start to do this thing, maybe I'll find I'm an 8 out of 10, but I'm going to start as a 10 out of 10 rather than start as a 0 out of 10, right? Which is important in the moment of pivot. I think the third won't be a book. I would encourage people to listen to Oprah's Masterclass podcast, and in particular, the one on Oprah's own life, the one on Steve Harvey, and the one on Dr. Maya Angelou, those 3. So I think those 3 podcasts, if you listen to those 3 podcasts, I think it's, it's just amazing. And one more surprising one was Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, as that his Masterclass podcast was amazing. For a movie or a series, watch The Last Dance, the Chicago Bulls documentary. This has changed my life.
Yeah.
I think look, the last question has kind of been answered around the aha and the bumps. So what I would want to do is close out and give you the last word. Any other resources, tips, recommendation, how people can reach you. You're doing a book, you're doing a show. Tell us more so that you can close out.
Okay. So I guess what I want to say is, as a scientist, I've discovered that every creature or plant or tree that I've come across is perfectly adapted for where God planted it, okay, for where it came into being. I've come to deeply believe the same is true about people. So I do believe that you have been born both into a context and to a world of possibilities around you that actually, if you dare to do it, you can actually live your best life, right? I firmly believe that. So I really want to invite you to know yourself better, get into the habit of reflecting, being curious about your joys, your passion, really try to accelerate your path to living the life that you were born to do, okay? Not living the life that you thought you should have, but really living the life that you were born to do. So yeah, dare to be you, right? That's what I would say.
All right. No, thanks very much, Thokozile. Thanks very much for coming and all the wisdom. Like I said, we ended up anyway. Thanks for accepting joining us Women's Month next month. Thokozile is coming again to bring more fire. She talks about women and women empowerment and how men should step up their game to do more shopping for their wives at the malls. That is going to be very exciting. But thank you. I also want to just say thank you before Manda introduce the last speaker, to the team, which is Towa in the background, Moavi and Mandisa, just for putting this together. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, all right. So next week, guys, we've got Natasha Dukes, right? And this is the power of the networking that we've built through this platform. Natasha was a recommendation by Mamello. Remember Mamello? I won't talk about her McKinsey life, but she came and blew the house, and she said she came across this fantastic, talented lady that she works with who actually spoke about purpose. And we are looking forward to having her next week. So please tune in and spread the word. Let's make this community thrive. Let's make it big. Reach out to Thokozile, buy her book, support her show, and let's keep on learning and growing.
Manda, what did you say? 100 books you're buying already. What was that?
I'm already taking payments for the pre-order.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.